Hello, 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 and welcome to another episode of Podcast Pasta. That's a podcast that's like pasta, not the podcast that's about pasta. As always, I'm your host, Mike. So I've kind of hit this interesting dichotomy with Podcast Pasta, and longtime followers of the show might be aware of this, but if you're new to the channel, thank you for tuning in. Uh, with Podcast Pasta, there's kind of two aspects to it. On one hand, you have kind of these solo episodes I do where I talk about like my takes regarding like media from like film and television, sometimes video games, whatever comes to my mind I feel like would be interesting to talk about. And on the other hand, I do like interviews where I talk with, well, especially as of late, like digital artists, but just creatives in general. And I've never really done a solo episode where I've talked about my interest in, art outside of like film and television. And so I thought that would actually be an interesting approach. And I think for today I kind of actually want to talk about what is slowly becoming my favorite, I guess I'll say like form factor of art, and that is street art or graffiti. Right. I'm very deliberate in using the term like form factor over style because, as I'll talk about later in this episode, there isn't one unifying style for graffiti. It is kind of this mishmash and blending of different styles and techniques. But yeah, that's what I want to talk about today. Talk about my interest and fascination with graffiti. Now, initially, when I had conceived this episode, like a lot of other, topics, I tend to prefer bringing an expert on the topic to discuss it at length with them. But unfortunately, due to the nature of street art and graffiti, I find it very difficult to find like artists that specialize in that because obviously it's not something that you want to like promote out to the world. So unfortunately, for the time being, it'll just have to be me talking about the topic on my own. I'm still open to bringing on people, so if there are any, street artists, or graffiti artists listening to this episode, and you want to talk more about your craft, hit me up. Leave a comment down below, and we can try setting something up. Before stepping further into this topic, though, I must emphasize, especially for legal reasons, that I do not condone the defacing of any type of, property, and that does come from a genuine place. Like, I understand that if you own a building, you might not necessarily want like paint on it, and I get, that, right? Uh, but this video is coming from the perspective that like since graffiti exists in our day-to-day lives, I figured that it's worthwhile to like kind of examine it regardless, right? It's kind of like the similar way that we like study crime. It's not because we like that crime exists, but you study to understand like why it exists and how it impacts our culture. Okay, so you might be asking yourselves, Mike, why the fascination with graffiti? And that is kind of an interesting question. I think, at least for me, graffiti kind of hits this interesting intersection of a few different things. That it is expression meets politics meets stunt. In terms of expression, that's kind of interesting to talk about with graffiti because, unlike other art forms or like art form factors, right? There might not necessarily be a deeper meaning to a lot of graffiti, pieces of graffiti that you see in your day to day life. Like most of the time, it is just an aesthetic endeavor, right? Or like just a display of the artist's techniques. That's why you see a lot of times it is just stylized, typography, or maybe occasionally you'll see like a character done, but it's not really meant to be like that much deeper than that. So for me, the expressiveness of graffiti really does come from like the individual nature of it. Now, don't get me wrong, there is like kind of some unified stylistic choices done in graffiti, and that's mainly from artists learning from each other. But it would be very like I mentioned before, it'd be very improper to say that there's one unifying style to graffiti because there's like so much that goes into it. a lot of it just depends on, the region that the artist exists in, the even sometimes like the material that you use can influence, the look of graffiti and stuff like that. So I love the individualistic nature of graffiti, and especially in the face of like, this AI slop era where, there is, with a lot of like digital art, it just kind of, as much as I do love a lot of digital art, a lot of it can kind of just bleed together after a while. But with graffiti, you just get such a uniqueness to it for every piece. The politics that go into graffiti and street art, admittedly, I'm not as well versed in talking about. There have been other YouTubers like, and honestly, where I've taken a lot of inspiration from this video is, I mentioned him before. Renegade Cut a while back did, an episode talking about, the politics and like the cultural significance of graffiti. But to put it in like the most basic terms, like, a lot of sociologists kind of observe that with graffiti, it is kind of this reclamation of space, right? That increasingly our environments are kind of becoming inhuman and inhospitable to us. So graffiti is kind of a way to fight back and fight against that, and to kind of put our human mark on an environment that is like just sometimes unfamiliar to us. And again, I have to emphasize, I don't condone the defacing of property, but I understand that kind of instinct, especially because a lot of people will say that like graffiti is this like new age thing and that it shows the deterioration of society. But for me, it extends since like time in memoriam, right? Since like cave paintings, and there was even that I wish I could remember the name. There's like that weird like character thing that like it was like during World War II or something that they would draw on like walls and stuff like that. So I think as long as there are walls, there are people willing to and wanting to paint them. Which kind of goes into my next point of like the stunt aspect of graffiti. Now, this is one thing that you might not like necessarily think about, right? Because for especially a lot of people living in a city, like graffiti and like street art kind of just exist in the background, right? Like it is like, I mean, don't get me wrong, it is interesting, but like as you're going from your day to day, you can't just stop and like look at every piece, right? You have to like live your life, so it kind of blends into the background. But when you think about like a lot of like street art, there's kind of the interesting logistical questions that exist. Let me give you examples. So for a lot of what I do for work is like driving. I do like Uber food delivery stuff, right? And it takes me like all over my local town, and I tend to notice like the place that I notice graffiti the most are like trains, right? And that kind of makes sense, right? Because it's highly visible spot, like trains move across like state lines or what have you. So like if you want a way to display your work that travels across borders, what better way than a train, right? But unlike buildings and stuff like that, and this is just me kind of vibing it out, but I imagine a lot of like train companies don't really care that much to clean graffiti off the train, because their logic is, well, as long as the train moves, as long as it doesn't add too much weight or anything, like who cares, right? um but yes, but if you think about it, like, oh, graffiti on a train, that's like whatever. But like think about the actual logistics of it. Like in order for an artist to tag a train, they have to like sneak into a train yard, right? Like I imagine not an easy feat, right? Like I couldn't certainly do it. Sneak into a train yard, get on a train, and mind you, trains are like massive structures. They're not like just easy things to climb, and like tag it and then get out without anybody noticing. It's impressive. I don't know what to tell you. Like, yeah, gotta give him props. And it's not only that too. Like, there are like sometimes you notice like graffiti on buildings, but it's like high up, right? And you have to think about like how did they climb up there and like do that, right? And a lot of times it is to the artist's detriment. Like I remember a news story. There was like a construction building that was like famous for tagging, and like the media had to warn people not to go up there because you were risking your own lives being on like an active construction site, tagging. But people do it for the love of the game, right? Um, and I just find it so fascinating and so interesting. Graffiti exists at kind of this unfortunate nexus point for a lot of larger society because, as I've talked about, a lot of people, sometimes rightfully so, condone it, right? Like, it isn't something that I imagine you really want to encourage in a society because, of like its negative stigma or anything like that. But on the other hand, it influences so much of our culture outside of like street art, right? Like there are several video games and media that takes inspiration from like the tagging subculture, right? For example, a game that I prominently play, Street Fighter 6, features like you know graffiti as a part of its style everywhere, from like UI elements to like even the personality of some characters like Kimberly. Um, Even going beyond that, like you have Miles Morales in like the Across the Spider Verse movies, who himself is very inspired by like the tagging subculture, right? And I think there's even a scene where you see him like, spray painting like an abandoned subway thing with his uncle. Um, so it's kind of unfortunate that it's on one hand this thing that we condemn, but also really love. Kind of like we crave it as like a type of aesthetic in our day to day lives, and that leaves taggers and graffiti artists in such like an awkward place in our society. So yeah, in summary, I really love graffiti. For me, I think especially in the modern day and age, it is still one of the most human forms of art out there. And not to say that it can't be influenced by AI. I imagine that, AI can, with how invasive AI is in our day-to-day life, it might find its way in graffiti. But again, I can't really imagine why, right? I think that's also kind of a great appeal to AI, or I'm not sorry, not AI, to street art, is that it isn't something that like AI will necessarily want to create, both because of the culture around like a lot of AI dude bros, as well as just by the nature of graffiti, the fact that it has to be something that you have to physically put out into the world, right? And that I don't think, I mean, certainly a machine on its own wouldn't be interested in that. And I think, a lot of AI tech bros like look down on street art as like a lesser form of expression, even though it's as real as it gets, to be honest. But I think that is going to do it for me. I must reiterate that I do not condone the defacing of property, but this is purely as just a scholastic exploration into why graffiti is cool. Should not be done, but is cool. Yeah, that's gonna do it from me. Thank you so much for joining me today. Let's see, what ending bit do I want to go on? Um, yeah, I guess I will end on like this whole, if you like the episode, leave a comment, subscribe, like whatever. But I am really curious to see what people kind of want from me. It's always kind of confusing if, how much of my audience is interested in like these solo episodes, or how much are just for the interviews. So I'm always curious to see where people sit with my content. Uh, yeah. Is anybody else looking forward to? I don't know if I'm the only one that's looking forward to the upcoming Plague Tale. Like, was it like a prequel game or something? Uh, yeah, I might be checking that out. Whatever. Later.